Planning Commission to order it. Is the roll been called?
Want to check with Jacob?
Jacob?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, all are present except for Commissioner Friedrich from the Planning Commission.
Do we have any additions or deletions to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move into staff recommendation reports. Jacob, would you like to talk about the Planning Commission's 2018 annual report?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Mayor. In keeping with past years, the annual report is formatted in much the same manner that you're accustomed to seeing. On page 1, you'll see an overview of the applications that were received and processed by the Planning Department in 2018. I make that distinction just to remind everyone that we do have an administrative review process, and so some of the applications that are referenced in this table are applications that are reviewed and approved by staff rather than going before the Planning Commission. Planning Commission had 11 meetings last year, including their joint meeting with the City Commission in May. I provided an overview there of some of the distinctions with the Planning Commission considering cases primarily in 2018 under the new zoning ordinance. We had 10 applications that were approved that were not approvable under the prior zoning ordinance. And we received 4 applications that were either delayed submittals, where an applicant was waiting for the code change to submit, or there were 2 of those, and then 2 cases that were resubmitted with a new application to use the new standards rather than the old. The Planning Commission was pretty busy beyond implementing the new zoning ordinance. We started work towards the new city master plan, and I would hope that within the next couple of weeks we'll have some more information about the public engagement activities that will be taking place in April related to that project. In May, the Planning Commission worked on toward adoption of the medical marijuana facilities regulations, and we'll be looking forward to implementing those in the next couple months as well. At the end of 2018, we learned that the city is now eligible to be certified as a redevelopment-ready community. There was a lot of work on the part of many boards and commissions, including the Planning Commission and City Commission, in order to adopt plans or realign policies and programs toward the best practices of the RRC program. And we'll be receiving that certification officially at your next City Commission meeting on March 11th. Provided a quick overview of development activity. One of the major highlights of the past year was a significant uptick in the number of short-term rentals in the community. These are commonly called Airbnbs after the website or app that a lot of folks use to list a short-term rental. These weren't previously allowed in Mount Pleasant. They are treated as a special use, and we've had 5 of those approved in the 2018 calendar year. A couple other major projects of note, a new 60-unit apartment complex was approved at Broomfield and Crawford, which is now being called the Bravado. We had an accessory dwelling unit that was approved. That's the first that's been approved under the new zoning ordinance, and those had been illegal since 1971 in the city of Mount Pleasant, unless they existed legally prior to that date. We had the remodel of the South Mission Street McDonald's, which was the very first project approved under the new zoning ordinance. And we had the approval of a new rooming dwelling on Douglas Street, which we're anticipating will be under construction this spring. That was the first rooming dwelling approved under the new zoning ordinance. And I guess I'll jump ahead in terms of master plan implementation having to do with the 2014 master plan. We made pretty significant progress on that front this year. Many items in the implementation plan from that master plan were accomplished with the adoption of the zoning ordinance in January. I'll conclude. I know we're going to talk about the work plan and goals for 2019 tonight. I'll just conclude by giving you a introduction to the Community Improvement Award winners that were selected for 2018. One cool thing about these projects is that they're the first of their kind, respectively, that were constructed under the new zoning ordinance. And so the residential award goes to a single-family home that was constructed at 313 East Gaylord. This had been previously a vacant lot for a number of years, and so this infilled that block in a big way. And the commercial award, as I mentioned, went to the first project approved under the new zoning code, which was the McDonald's remodel on South Mission Street.
Thank you. Jacob, I'd just like to say, all the hard work you put in for the redevelopment, ready community designation that we'll be recognizing at our next commission meeting. I know that that was years in the progress, and something that I'm sure you're really proud of, and the commission is certainly really pleased at the opportunities that the city will be able to take advantage to that completion.
Yeah, I would say it was greatly appreciated to have the City Commission's support to engage in that program back in 2016, and there have been a lot of people involved in getting us prepared for certification, and as a competitive person, I'm really excited that we are the first community in Region 5 of the state to receive certification, so we're ahead of some of our peer cities in the region in that regard, and hopefully it situates us well for the future.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the professional abilities of our staff, and obviously you yourself also shepherding in a new zoning ordinance, and the Planning Commission as well. Commissioner Kulik.
Short-term rental. The short-term rentals that we now allow as a special use permit, do those require any inspection by code enforcement, fire department before they're certified?
That's a great question, and yes, they're treated like a rental in the same regard that any other long-term rental receives a rental license by the city, so the fire department's conducting those inspections and managing that housing licensing process, and that's actually written right into the special use permit criteria for short-term rentals. No, we haven't. I'm trying to think. The last time we had a project denial in my tenure was in 2015. We had a special use permit denial at the Planning Commission, but every project that's been brought forward since then has received an approval.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ling.
Commissioner Ling, with that one, you have to hold it down while you talk. Yeah, it's one from the
down here? Okay,
Sorry.
there we go. Okay. I wanted to echo what Mayor Joseph said about all of the work that went into being certified as a redevelopment-ready community, and I think it is a significant accomplishment for the city. I did have just a couple of questions on some of the numbers that were in here. One, so it's kind of a follow-up on that site plan review number. So that is down to, do I understand correctly that that's down to 12, not because we have less site plans being reviewed, because those are the only ones that went to the Planning Commission, or were these all of the site plans?
That's all of the site plans.
Oh, that is all the site plans. So then my question is there a reason why there were significantly fewer in this last year?
My supposition is if you balanced out the 2017 and 2018 numbers, we had a number of applications come in at the tail end of 2017 for folks who wanted more certainty about the regulatory environment, and so they knew the zoning code of the time and they could plan for that, and so they targeted their submittal deadlines to get ahead of that date. And I think on the converse of that, folks were waiting. There wasn't a lot of certainty around the new year about when the new zoning ordinance would be adopted and take effect. And so for the first couple of months of the year, we did have some delay in people taking action. Generally speaking, we see our highest volume of applications in that time period, between maybe November and March. when people are trying to get those secured so they can obtain building permits and construct during the summer. And so I think that held back the a number of cases that we received this year for that reason.
Okay, thanks. Also, I noticed that you indicated that there were 10 applications that would not have been able to be approved under the old ordinance that could be approved now, and I assume would be the accessory building on Arnold would be an example. Are there some other examples of things that we're now able to do that we couldn't do before or are doing in it?
Sure, great question. So the short-term rentals would be one example of that. The accessory dwelling was another. We had a couple of projects where, for instance, the McDonald's on South Mission, because of reconfigurations of that parking lot and a loss of parking spaces, the site was already parking deficient and wasn't eligible for a parking variance under our prior zoning code. And so that project wouldn't have been able to come forward for approval under that prior zoning ordinance without a reduction in the amount of work that was being done to the site. We had another project adjacent to downtown that was similarly situated, that the project would have required parking that wasn't physically possible to provide on the property given its layout, and it wasn't eligible for a parking variance, and so it wouldn't have been able to happen.
Thank you.
Commissioner Cooley.
Since the recreational marijuana issue passed on the November election, has the Planning Commission at all talked about what they want to see?
They have not, and I have not brought that topic forward to them in anticipation that that conversation would likely start with the City Commission and trickle down. The Planning Department has received a lot of inquiries about recreational marijuana, though, over the past several years, and continue to do so up to and including today.
And at the staff level, we've been trying to determine the best time to start those discussions, whether it be at the City Commission level or the Planning Commission level, because the State Department has 1 year to put all their regulations in place before any licenses can be given, and that 1 year would be up in approximately November. And so we've been trying to decide how much of that conversation do we want to have before we see those state regulations versus starting to see some of those, and have been trying to figure out the correct timing to recommend.
And we all saw how prompt the state was with the medical marijuana getting their regulations in place. I wouldn't hold our breath.
Well, the challenge with this one, though, is if the state doesn't do it in a year, then it falls upon the locals to have to be responsible for that licensing. So we're certainly hopeful that that doesn't happen.
Plus, we have to opt out, not opt in like we did on medical marijuana.
Right, it's the opposite. It's assumed that the city is in unless we take action to be out. So that's the first decision that has to be made, and then if we're in, we have to decide whether we want to set any limits on numbers or locations.
I feel like we're straying a little bit into 2019. Is there any more discussion on the 2018 annual report before we move on? Commissioner Ling.
I just had one other question. It's kind of related to the continuation of the master plan, but I noticed in here that there were, on the things that were supposed to be accomplished in the 2014 master plan, two of the things that were aimed for 2020 and therefore aren't done yet were the Chippewa River overlay and I think the Main Street overlay. And I was just curious about whether or not that's likely at this point. Do we anticipate we'll be continuing to look at those going into the new master plan, or if we are going in a different direction at this point?
I would anticipate we'll be, we've obviously shared the current master plan with our consultant, and I would expect when we begin taking the results of the public engagement and looking at what people are asking for in the future, we can also touch back on our current implementation plan and see how and what to bring forward to propose, including in that. I'm not anticipating, given the workload that master plan process will entail, that we'll necessarily tackle those topics in the next 18 months. So if they are addressed, it would likely be under the premise of the new master plan.
Commissioner Toles.
Yours should just stay on.
Okay, I've got a question on, if we got a time frame for the planning commission to review the zoning ordinance?
I think that's kind of jumping into 2019.
Is it 19?
Is there any more discussion on the 2018 annual report? Okay, we'll move into 2019. And Jacob, did you want to start? Leslie?
Well, we did have a committee meeting on amendments that need to be made to the zoning ordinance, mostly housekeeping amendments, and set priorities to what things we're going to focus on this year, keeping in mind that recreational marijuana will probably have to be addressed at some point this year. There was, so the amendments we identified as needing to be addressed are where there's some Scrivener's errors that need to be corrected, and also to address non-conforming parking lot issues and multifamily recycling and fencing, which the First Amendment will be introduced in the March meeting. And then after that, we'll have a work session in May to discuss the non-conforming parking lots with the other issues to follow as time allows.
Commissioner Toles.
Again, that's all started in 2018 and carried over to 2019 now. What I'm wondering is there's 8 or 10 businesses right now that have put maintenance on hold. Springtime is coming right now, and the way I read that ordinance is, if it doesn't change the conformity of the lot, you can repave your parking lot or driveway. And I'm wondering how long this is going to drag out and take when most of these people want to do their work on their businesses this spring. And we're saying now it's going to be May before we look at this?
Well, we do have a lot on our plate.
I know we do,
We have a
but
master plan, and, I don't know, have we had 10 people come forward and ask,
there's at least 10, ma'am. I have a list.
do you have the list?
I do not.
I can get the list to you.
That would be helpful.
And to clarify for everybody, the distinction that we've made on parking lots, just to make sure everybody understands that, is if it's normal maintenance, which includes things like crack sealing or overlay, those are allowed already in the ordinance without having to come into full compliance. The ones that are not currently allowed and are more difficult is when reconstruction takes place. So when it becomes a crush and shape and we get into the base of the parking lot is when it's considered reconstruction, and non-conforming properties would have to be in full compliance when they get to that level. So I think that's the piece that the Planning Commission is going to focus on is that the right threshold for reconstruction in regard to non-conforming properties? Is that accurate, Jacob, about where the conversation will be focused?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the challenge is that it's, each situation has its own nuances, and so we have non-conforming parking lots, we have parking lots associated with non-conforming uses. You can have your parking lot can be non-conforming for dozens of different reasons, and so it may require I think it's going to require more thought to make sure that the outcome is appropriate and that the community is comfortable with the outcome, because for some of these parking lots, this has been an issue since 1984, many of them, and so in those instances, this would be a change of policy that's been in place for almost 40 years. So we don't want to be rash about changing a policy that's really not a new policy that started in January of 18, but really a policy that's been on the books for at least in some cases 35 years.
Vice Mayor Gillis.
I remember in October or November, we had some issues that we sent to the Planning Commission. Do you recall what those were? Because I don't think they were.
Off the top of my head, we had a couple issues submitted from, one from Mr. Olivieri about single-family home standards. We had one from a property owner on the west side of Mount Pleasant regarding driveways. And I know the Planning Commission, I don't recall if it went through the City Commission, we had a correspondence regarding solar energy, and where and how solar farms would be permitted in the city. And those three items are on the list of items that the committee reviewed. They just were not prioritized at the beginning of 2019 because, for one thing, the parking lot issue was identified as being the most critical to address, since that seemed to, at least per the information that we have received, be the one impacting the most people. And it seems like it's been an issue the longest. And so we felt like the time sensitivity was highest with that issue.
And those were the three issues that were referred by the City Commission: the parking lot issue, the driveway width, and the single-family residential. So the third one that Jacob was trying to remember from the City Commission was the parking lot issue.
And the one from Joe Oliveri, which is, I'm thinking the garage had to be pulled forward from the house and the pitch of the roof.
Those were his two primary concerns with the single-family residential.
And that's included in the three
Yes,
that we submitted?
that you submitted, yes.
Is that it would be included in the ones you're going to look at before May? Or no?
May was simply to talk about parking lots.
Okay.
So the ones that would still be hanging out there that the City Commission referred would be the single-family residential and the driveway width. Those would still be on the list to be prioritized after that.
Are we doing the parking lot before May?
The plan is to bring that forward for work session at your May meeting.
So all the businesses that can't repave their parking lot have to wait till after May?
Many of the businesses that can't repave their parking lot have been waiting for 30-plus years. So yeah, the idea was that would give us time to gather information so that we could have a productive work session. The other point of discussion in that prioritization and timing was the fact that our medical marijuana facilities are going to be coming forward through our planning commission process in April and May. And so trying to align that around those cases, because those are likely to be time-consuming, as well as the master plan process, which is going to be taking place in the month of April. Let's try not to overload staff or the planning commission.
Do you hold your work sessions after your planning commission's regular meeting?
Generally, yes.
Okay. So you only meet once a month?
Correct.
Okay. Do you think your other commissioners would be open to maybe meeting twice a month, just in the beginning of 2019, to address some of these issues? Just throwing it out there.
I
know.
personally can't be here on the third Thursday of the month. I don't know about anybody else.
Okay.
That's when the other meeting was. That would be an issue.
Okay.
Can't speak for anyone else, though.
It just that kickoff of the master plan, there's going to be extra meetings and things, and
Understand.
it's just, I love my little spot here, but
Yeah.
Are there any other items for discussion? Commissioner Ling?
Obviously, there are going to be a lot of things that have come up with the new zoning ordinance, because it's a whole new way of looking at things. Without getting you dragged into a current controversy, one of the things that's kind of come up in the last few weeks has to do with the widths of roads, and whether or not, and what's the ideal width. And so in order to broaden this question a little bit, I'll ask it this way. I guess I've ended up being a little bit confused between having a complete street and a street that accommodates all kinds of uses like parking and the cars and bike lanes, which I envisioned myself as, so a wide street's kind of good because then you can put all that on, versus a narrow street meeting other kinds of issues like best land use practices, for example. So I guess what I see are a lot of conflicting things going on at the same time. But needless to say, some of us are dealing with an issue now about narrowing a street without necessarily being quite aware that that was going to be happening. So I guess what I'd like to say, so if we looked at Crapo, for example, not to get specific on a street, and as I was looking at this discussion, I'm thinking, so are we looking at maybe narrowing Crapo? And I'm not going to take a position on it other than to say, I really like it because it's easy to ride on it. And so it's kind of the bike lane aspect of it that I'm wondering about. So I just wondered, what is there about the new zoning ordinance, and does that then mean that each time we do a reconstruct, we're likely to be narrowing a street?
I'll start and then you can jump in.
Sure.
I don't think the zoning ordinance requires us to narrow streets, but as we started looking at the new zoning ordinance, we've tried to make sure that as we do projects that we're in compliance with as many of the recommendations in the zoning ordinance as possible, just as we expect private property owners to become in compliance. Although they're required to, we're just recommending we be. So there are provisions in the zoning ordinance that talk about the widths of neighborhood connector streets, which is what we've been starting to design our streets around. Now, it doesn't mean that every single street we would do that on, because that's part of the thing about complete streets is you want to design the street for all users of the street. And sometimes that means they should have shared lanes, depending on the traffic patterns. Other times it means they should have their own bike lanes. And so it really depends on the activity level of the street about how you implement a complete streets kind of concept. So I wouldn't want anybody to think we're going to narrow every single street according to those guidelines, because it really depends on the traffic patterns on that street.
Yeah, I would just add that when we adopted the Complete Streets Ordinance in 2015, I think one of the major confusions in the public was about what that meant for road design. And simply put, complete street doesn't mean it's a street with a facility, a designated separate facility for every road user. A complete street can look very different. You could have multitude of different types of streets that are all complete. It's really based on the context. In this case, to kind of further explain the context of the road design principles that are in the zoning ordinance, those are meant to apply when we're constructing a new neighborhood with brand new streets that aren't already existing. There's no trigger in the zoning ordinance for a zoning review of an existing street in the city of Mount Pleasant and the reconstruction of that street. So in the instance of Maple Street, there's no planning review that's taken place of that road design. I haven't seen road plans. I haven't issued an approval letter. That's not a part of that process. And just to give you a sense of how standards can differ, you know, the Public Works Department already has great road design standards that they have used for a long time, and they've looked at those standards to make sure they align with our Complete Streets Ordinance. Their standards in some cases would actually call for slightly narrower streets than the zoning ordinance, even though the zoning ordinance is aiming for the same target. They're typically very close to each other, but there is still, you know, a foot or two of difference here and there just because of the difference of approach. But just to be clear, that's not, when we say we're trying to target, if we're gonna build a new street somewhere else, we'd like it to look like an existing street here. It is truly just a desire to have that consistency.
Okay, that's very helpful, actually, because that was kind of my impression also, that it was about building new neighborhoods. So that's
Yeah.
very, thank you.
But to expand on that a bit more too, the thinking was, though, when we have an opportunity to reconstruct a street, which we only do every 40 or 50 years,
Right.
that's an ideal opportunity to try to have it meet current guidelines. And so that's what we've been trying to do as we start to design those, even though we're not required to because it's not a new street. It's such a major reconstruction, it's an opportunity to do that.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Commissioner Cooley?
I'd like to thank the Planning Commission for all the work they put in last year, and it's not going to get any better this year, but thank you very much.
I do have a quick question. Is there an actual list of the proposed amendments to the zoning code that the Planning Commission is supposed to look at? Seems to me I've seen one somewhere, but I don't know if it's actually been issued to the Planning Commission yet.
There's not an official list. We had the 3 referred items from the city commission last year, which were included in your November meeting packet. And then any other issues that the planning commission has identified. And then I've got my own separate list of, from notations to the code that we've identified and using the code of things we might want to consider. We took the commission forwarded items as well as the list I had and just kind of looked in general at what the priorities were in that committee meeting, and it became clear pretty quickly that the parking lot issue was the main priority and that there was a need to reserve some time and space for recreational marijuana and for the master planning process, and that's basically where we got with the list.
Okay, but this is something that a meeting or something where the members can propose stuff that might have been missed?
Absolutely. You're welcome to raise an issue to me directly or to bring, per the work discussion conversation we had back in December, you can bring those issues to the chair or vice chair.
Sounds like we're going to have more than 3 or 4 to look at then, probably.
I would assume, yeah. I mean, historically, the zoning code's been amended about 3 or 4 times a year forever, so we'll be amending it until we replace it with the next zoning code.
Any other discussion? Okay. I'd like to echo Commissioner Cooley's comments. Thank you for the Planning Commission and Jacob Kane for coming today. Looking forward to the development of the master plan and amendments to the zoning ordinance, and any way we can work together, let us know. Commissioner, or Chairman Honig, would you have any comments?
Well, thank you, and certainly we appreciate the work the city commission puts in, and that's it.
Okay. I move for a motion to adjourn. Oh, sorry.
Public comments?
We'll have a public comment section. If you'd like to make a public comment, please come up to the podium, state your name, your address, and you have 5 minutes.
Do I need to turn the mic on? I'm Charlie Kinzel. I live on Glen Avenue. My concern is I've only been in town for 3 years, but I would like to impress that I know you have other important issues, but I'm a fan of a blight ordinance. I see around our neighborhood, in just the 3 years I've been here, the slowly degradation that's going on and piling up in yards because there was no blight ordinance. All it does is devalue everybody's property, and I feel it's an important issue. Thank you.
Is there anyone else from the public who'd like to make comment? Seeing no one come forward, I will close the public comment section and move to adjourn.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned.